Donner la parole à professeur Alvaro CUERVO-CAZURRA, qui devrait intervenir donc sur la question du rôle et des fonctions et du contrôle par le conseil d'administration. Sir, the floor is yours.
Okay, let me see if I can. Okay, can you see my screen? Hello? Hello?
Yeah.
Everything is good? Okay,
Yeah,
great,
it's okay. If just you can take out the left side and leave just the slide itself.
Okay, let me see if I can.
Otherwise, they can make it here as well. Well, maybe this way is... Okay. We don't have your presentation, so it's up to you now.
Is this now?
Yeah.
Now?
No, yes. Yeah, now it's okay.
No, it's good, it's great. Thank you. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I am delighted to be here talking to you about governance of state-owned companies and in particular the role of the board of directors. I am an expert on the state-owned enterprises and mostly the strategic and internationalization of them. And here I'd like to do, based on the agenda that I saw, something that is maybe what I think might be more useful, or it's a different way of presenting ideas, and I'd like to mostly get into a more practical discussion. The reason is that much of what has been presented before, that we can summarize it and try to apply it to actual companies. And what I'd like to do is, for all of you in the audience, think about the company that you work for, if you are a manager or if you are working in the government, in some of the ministries. Think of one of the companies that you are providing oversight, one of the companies that is under your area of control. And if you are students, PhD students, master students, think about one of the state-owned companies. And what I'd like to do is try to get into a discussion of a few questions so that we can go deeper into understanding what is the state-owned company, how does the board operate here, and how does it make sure that the state-owned company operates better. So what I'd like to do is, with this exercise, go through three different topics. One is going to be the state-owned enterprise, and one in particular, rather than in general, about the company you're working for, you have oversight or you are interested in, and let's think about the objectives of this company, and with the idea of achieving clarity. And this is, if you want, one of the particular challenges of state-owned companies in comparison to private firms, that in some cases there isn't really a fully clear objective for the firm. The other thing I'd like then to discuss is the board of directors and try to get into best practices. How does the board operate? And here, if you want, the main message is independence of decisions, so that the board had helped the company achieve those objectives. And then finally, the last the topic I'd like to discuss is going to be the story of effectiveness. How do we match the objectives of the company with the way in which the board operates so that we basically achieve success? So with this, let's start with a few questions I'd like you to do. And if you can please take a piece of paper or just in the computer, and let's go through a few of these issues. So the first question is going to be, and this is to some extent one of the typical criticisms of state-owned companies. You may agree or disagree, but the story is one in which different from private companies, state-owned companies do not have clear objectives. And this is mostly because as a state-owned enterprise, they tend to be designed to achieve multiple objectives. So I'd like to try to now get into a deeper discussion. We can have it later. And let's start with, if you want, traditional arguments from economics. So why do we have state-owned companies? Typical story is, well, the government has to step in and has to own companies because the markets are not perfect, and this is one way to solve those market imperfections. Some of them is that in many cases, this was a traditional argument, and there is a natural monopoly. It is more efficient for only one company to operate in one location, typically one country. And therefore, if we have a private company become the monopolist, they may abuse that monopoly position, which may not be good for the development of the country. They will reduce the quantity provided, and they will increase prices. So therefore, maybe it is good for the state to become the monopolist and provide those goods. The other argument, which is another approach from economics, is the idea of externalities. In some occasions, in some areas, it is good for companies to become state-owned because they can try to promote more positive externalities. Otherwise, private companies, yes, they will try to price and provide the goods at the level in which they achieve profitability, but they don't understand that the country can benefit much more if there is an over-provision of goods. Typical argument behind the explanation of education and why we have a state-owned provision of education, either primary, secondary, or in some cases universities. And also there is a story of negative externalities. In some cases, some operations might create too many negative impact on society, and therefore it might be good for the government to own those particular operations, with the idea that they are going to be pushing that a particular negative activity to a lower level. And then the third one is that all of these, yes, there is always the question of why do we have to have a state ownership? There is always alternatives for the government. One of them is going to be taxes. And if you want to increase or decrease certain products, you can try to tax it more so that the products are less sold. Or you can provide subsidies, negative taxes, so that companies have an incentive to provide more of that particular product or service. Or you can basically get into regulation and mandates. Try to ask companies, private companies, to do certain activities, provide telecommunications in rural areas, for example, or try to avoid them to doing certain activities. In the case of negative externalities, for example, is pollution. So the question here is, for those of you working for a state-owned company, or if you work in the ministry, the company from an economic point of view, what are the market imperfections that are currently being solved? Are there companies that are private? How will they provide similar products or services? And this is what I'd like to get deeper into. What about externalities? If this is an issue of, look, there is an under provision of these goods, public transportation in cities, electricity, sewage, why is it that the company, the state-owned company is operating, and how can private companies do this? And then finally, what about the story of regulations? Is the government able to regulate companies without ownership? And this is, if you want, always the tension between whether we should have a state-owned companies or whether the government should just be regulating private companies. So I'd like you to take 30 seconds and write down for the state company that you work for or you oversee, what are the, in your view, and this is different from the statements of the company, what is, in your view, the biggest economic driver for the existence of the company? Okay. With this, let's get into another explanation for the existence of state-owned enterprises. And this is, if you want, the political approach to state-owned companies. And here we have a story of control and a desire of control of particular governments. And this, in many cases, is historical. And And this is, if you want, one of the challenges of state-owned companies. Historically, they were created for particular reasons. Now we have them. What do we do with them? And here the story is one in which certain governments decide this particular industry, this particular activity is of a strategic for the country. This is in many cases the explanation behind the state ownership of defense industries, for example, or in some cases it is explanation for the state ownership of natural resources, with the idea that we need to control this type of activities so that we can basically help the country not only develop, which is the other biggest argument behind the state-owned enterprises, but also enable the country to defend itself against others in case of conflict or facilitate particular developments of the economy. The other thing is development. In many cases, private companies are unable or unwilling to invest in particular activities because they think that it is not, in many cases, going to be too profitable. Some cases, the idea is that, well, the country is not big enough to have one large operator, or we do not have the technology or the capabilities to do this, and therefore, in some occasions, it is the government the one who has to take this role so that it promotes development. In many cases, this was explanation of basic industries, big capital-intensive industries in which the government invested to provide, if you want, the underlying basis for other companies. Traditionally, this was a story of natural resources, still big industries, and therefore the private sector can then capitalize on state-owned investments and basically accelerate development. Or there is always the story of ideology. Some governments have an ideology of control. Other governments have an ideology of a market primacy. And this has been a pendulum between markets and governments that we have seen throughout history in the 20th and 21st century. And then it has evolved across countries. In some countries, a new government comes and decides, no, we think that markets are best, and therefore we have to let markets operate. Another government comes and thinks, no, a market are not working well, and therefore the government should intervene, and in some cases, the government should own the companies. And this has resulted in state-owned companies that have remained, in some cases, they go back to being privatized. In other cases, they are nationalized. So what I'd like now to do is, in the company you work for, or the company you are overseeing, or if you're a student, companies that you like, what is the political explanation for this, the existence of this company? How is it that we explain to the world that, look, this company should exist and be a state-owned company because of these particular reasons? So again, if you play with me with this little exercise, I think it is good so that we have a bit deeper discussion. Can you please take 30 seconds and outline a few of the, if you want, political explanations behind the existence of that company? Thank you.
Alvaro, may I suggest that you go through your presentation and focus mainly because we are short of time and we have many other.
How much time do we have?
Yeah, come on to the nitty-gritty of your presentation, and then because you see people who are sitting around, most of them are familiar with the issues that you have just pointed out.
Good.
What is most important is your key recommendations, how to move forward and to improve the quality, control, and role of BOD. Thanks.
Good, thank you. So then with this, let's get into board of directors. Main recommendation is going to be, and this is the challenge of the board of directors in state-owned companies, a story of independence. Having a board, designing a board that is going to be, yes, dependent on the government, because at the end of the day, these are state-owned companies, dependent on the government for support, but independent to some extent for in terms of decision-making. And this is one of the balances that boards of state-owned companies are going to have. The main thing is some best practices for effectiveness, size of the company, size of the board. Typical argument is going to be in terms of decision-making, less than 10 people. And again, here I'd like you to reflect, can go faster through this. How large is the board in this particular occasion? What about interactions in the meetings? Argument for smaller boards. It's easier to interact, it's easier to make decisions when the board is about 10 people. Over 10 people, it becomes to some extent overwhelming to have everybody participate, and in some cases, people choose not to contribute to the discussions. Fewer, less than 6 or 5, they may be dominated by 1 or 2 individuals, and as a result, they may not be optimal. Second recommendation. This is a composition, and it's a story of diversity in expertise, education, gender, age, the important notion of independent directors, and the separation of chair and CEO. Here, important things to consider. Reflecting on the members of the board, who are they? What is the level of diversity? And this is one of, if you want, the challenges that happens not only on boards of state-owned companies, but private companies as well. There tends to be relatively limited diversity. Gender is one of the biggest challenges. Some governments in advanced economies have pushed for a minimum percentage of women on boards. This seems to be being promoted, and in some cases, much of the research seems to indicate that there is much more discussion and better decisions on those boards. The important thing here is who are they representing, and especially the balance between internal and external managers. Most of the arguments seem to be on we don't really need to have many internal representatives on the board, and especially the important role of the CEO. The role of the board, we have 2 different ones. One is control, which is the typical financial approach. The other is the strategic approach. And then the board as a complement to the executive committee and the C-level suite. And here, the question I'd like to discuss is basically among the board members, who are the independents? How many independent board members do we have? And then finally, the other thing that is important to consider, the chair and the CEO, are they the same person? Best practices is a separation. And one of the challenges, or one of the things that we need to consider in terms of best practices, especially in the case of best practices of the state-owned companies, who appoints the CEO? One of the biggest, if you want, criticisms of state-owned enterprises is that CEOs change whenever governments change. And this creates a challenge for many of these companies that it's not quite the board, the one that is making decisions. It is kind of the government that becomes elected, the ones that is making decisions. How is the board? Who is the CEO? Who appointed the last CEO? What is the level of the ability of the board to basically have a level of independence from the particular government, so that the focus here is much more on what's good for the company, taking into account what happens with this particular company being state-owned, rather than being the board being basically a mechanism for the government that is in place to implement their own economic policy. So this is the story of independence. And then there is the arguments on the operation. In general, relatively best practices are relatively common meetings, at least minimum 4 to 6 meetings a year. With the traditional committees, but here the question is in the meetings, who is setting the agenda, whether the agenda is being driven by the chair or the overall board, and how is this agenda, especially for urgent meetings, how is this being implemented? Is it being driven by ministries, or is it being driven by the board and the management of the board? And then the other question I'd like to discuss, or I'd like you to reflect on, is on committees. Which are the committees? Yes, most companies are going to have the standard statutory committees, an executive committee, an audit, compensation, and nomination. The question is who gets selected, who is in this particular case operating in those committees, and how are individuals rotated across committees. And here the best practices seem to be, yes, we need some expertise, a few years, 2-3 years in one committee, but we also, in many cases, need the benefit of diversity in opinions and some rotations of board members across committees so that they gain expertise and they can basically provide those connections. And then the other thing is, the other question I'd like to discuss is how are the board members being evaluated, and how are they going to be renewed or not? How are they going to be changed over time? So here, best practices, external evaluations, and this is one of, if you want, challenges of state-owned companies, in which in some cases it is the ministry, the one that runs the evaluation. The challenge that we may have here is, and this might be then resulting in the ministry or minister or the government exercising influence on the board appointees, or the board appointees understanding that they are under the influence of the politicians and therefore making decisions not thinking about the company but actually the desires of the government who is in place. One of the biggest challenges of, if you want, in comparison, or one of the biggest criticisms of private companies in comparison to criticisms of state-owned companies in comparison to private companies is that there isn't, in many cases, much independence and there is little continuity in decisions. Is something that companies need to have, and the board is, and the role of the board is not only control of management, but mostly a strategic direction. This can be achieved through investments in relationships and over time working together without, with some degree of independence. And then finally, the story of renewal. Best practices, limited tenure, so that usually the recommendation here is about 12 years maximum for board members to be in one board. But at the same time, and this is important, stagger the board members so that the whole board is not accepted or dismissed at the same time, but there is some level of continuity in operations. And here again, something I'd like to have a discussion is what are the current tenure limits? Are there tenure limits? How are members being replaced? And who has the right to replace them? Yes, the government, as if you want, fiduciary role, has the ability to influence them, but mostly the benefit is to have an independent commission that basically evaluates them rather than being directly under particular governments or ministries. Then finally, again, to have some of the discussions, we can get into effectiveness. And this is how I'd like to connect to the initial discussion of state-owned companies and the clarity of the state-owned companies. How do we evaluate the success of the board of the state-owned company? First of all, identify stakeholders. Who are the main shareholders? Yes, these are state-owned companies. Wholly owned is going to be just the state. What happens when you have several private and the state owners at the same time? Who are they? Who are they having their representatives in the board? How do they interact? And then the other important thing is stakeholders. Many of, and this varies across countries, many of the discussions is whether we should include the labor employees as members of the board, so that there is some representation of those interests, and whether there are other type of interests that may be needed to be represented. Not directly as stakeholders, but especially for boards that have operations in areas which allow social impact, whether member of, if you want, interest groups should also be represented. The question is here, who is who are the main stakeholders who are being represented now, to discuss or to achieve two different goals. One is going to be value creation, and this is a story of effectiveness. Back to the discussion we had at the beginning, what is the logic for this state-owned company? How do we make sure that we are achieving those, if you want, economic objectives? How do we compare the solution of market imperfections, the monopoly, especially the case of externalities? Are we measuring externalities? Are we making sure that we are solving those externalities? And also the story of the political objectives. Is this a story of a strategic industry? Are we achieving or helping achieve development? How do we contribute to development? This is value creation. And of course, there is always the story of value capture. And this is the analysis of profitability. How do we make sure that we contribute to profitability? What happens, and this is the tension in state-owned companies, between value creation and value capture. Much of the criticism of state-owned companies is that they are highly unprofitable. The counter-criticism here is that, well, that might not be the objective of a state-owned company. The objective might be to achieve value creation and help society develop, because, for example, there is need for development in certain areas, or there is an issue of market imperfections, or especially externalities. If that is not the main objective, how do we make sure that we are going to nevertheless achieve a minimum level of profitability so that we can continue having self-sustaining operations rather than have to rely on other parts of the government to sustain the state-owned company? And this is one of, if you want, the biggest tensions, and this is an idea of state-owned companies. Let's clarify the objectives so that we understand the effectiveness of the board. So in conclusion, and this is the discussion I'd like to have for particular companies. First of all, clarify the objectives. Different from private companies, which is always, if you want, a simpler argument. The objective is to create value for shareholders, and most of this is measured as profitability. In the case of state-owned companies, we have tensions or we have challenges because we have multiple objectives. So for the board to operate best, the question is, do we have a clear objective for the state-owned company? Then the story is independence. We do need continuity. We do need individuals who are going to be working to help the company achieve its objectives. And how do we maintain the relationship with the government, who is going to be, to some extent, the fiduciary representative of the citizens, who at the end of the day are the owners of state-owned companies? And then finally, how do we achieve effectiveness in the success? How do we match the ability of the company to respond to shareholders and also other stakeholders? And especially, how do we manage the balance between value creation and value capture? And those are, to some extent, my arguments or my suggestions for the discussion. And I'll be happy to get into a debate or a conversation now.
Thank you, Alvaro, for this comprehensive presentation. I don't know if you will be able to stay with us a bit to listen to the other speaker, or we shall go directly to discussion if you have some constraints.
I can move a meeting. I'm happy to go to the next speaker.
Okay, thank you very much.